Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. Welcome to Echoes of Eden on this Monday evening as we are progressing through the Torah in its 54 divisions. Also, as part of our commitment to live in the times, as the evening has set upon us. That means it is coming upon the 14th day of the month of Adar, and that means Purim has officially begun. So you are now, a good thing to do would be to have some schnapps tonight, read the book of Esther, and then sometime tomorrow give food away, one to someone or a family that is in more need than you are, but then also to give food away to someone who has more than you do. That's just part of the tradition. So we have arrived in Purim, but the big thing would be to read the book of Esther. Last week's Torah class, I believe, made the connection between that portion, Tetzaveh, which is always read before Purim, and the connection of the hiddenness of God, if you remember that discussion, and the book of Esther being one of the two books in the Bible that does not specifically mention the name of God, but yet God's fingerprint is all over it. Last week's portion was the only portion after Moses is born where his name is not mentioned. So we kind of made that connection with Purim. But let us get started with the blessing before the study of Torah. So if you will, let's bow our heads. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'sivanu le'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to be immersed into the words and the matters of Torah. Amen. So this week is the portion known as TISA. TISA covers Exodus chapter 30, verse 11, and goes through the end of chapter 34. So a pretty good-sized portion, Exodus 30, verse 11 through the end of 34. TISA usually gets translated as when you take, but it literally means when you lift. When you lift. The TISA is coming from a verb that is, the root is nasa. How I remember that when I was beginning to learn Hebrew is nasa sounds a whole lot like NASA, right? And what do you think of when you think of NASA? Right? Rockets going up, lifting off, lifting up. So that's how I remembered that particular vocabulary word. We'll talk about why it gets translated when you take in this week's portion, but it really means to lift up. And that's how we are going to take it. We're going to take it very literal in this week's portion because it gives us some insight. And what all happens in TISA? What's going on in the portion? Well, it takes its name from Exodus chapter 30, verse 11. Usually translated when you take, meaning take a census, but we'll talk about the better translation in a minute. And then the people of Israel are told to each contribute exactly half a shekel of silver to the construction and the completion of the tabernacle. Not any more, not any less. It doesn't matter if you were a bazillionaire or if you were homeless. Everybody contributes half a shekel. Instructions are then given regarding making the tabernacle some of its furnishings, like the water basin, the anointing oil, and the incense. And wise-hearted artisans named Bezalel and Oholiav are placed in charge of the tabernacle's construction. And the people are once again commanded to keep the Sabbath. So once again, we have this recurring theme of the importance of the Sabbath, the importance of that rhythm of creation, that rhythm that is to be part of our lives if we want it to be spiritually and physically healthy, emotionally healthy, psychologically healthy, that we have to have rest as part of that rhythm. Once again, told to us that that is a key connection between us and our Maker. And then Moses goes up on the mountain, but when he does not return at the expected time, or when the people expected him. They somehow thought he was late or delayed. They began to panic. They began to let their imaginations get the best of them and assume that perhaps he died. That's a tall mountain. That's a rugged mountain. And so perhaps he fell and broke his neck. Perhaps a wild animal ate him alive. But he was not, according to their calculations, he was not back when they expected him. And so in his absence, there was a leadership vacuum. And is often the case when there is a leadership vacuum. Sometimes negativity gets sucked up into that. And so as a result, they make a golden calf to be kind of Moses' substitute, or the substitute connection between heaven and earth. They were trying to create the spiritual technology to create heaven and earth. Almost like a miniature Tower of Babel kind of thing going on here. And when God sees this, he proposes to destroy the people, that current nation. But Moses intercedes on their behalf. And then Moses descends from the mountain, carrying the tablets of testimony engraved with the 10 words. Seeing the people dancing with their idols, he smashes the tablets. He then destroys the golden calf, and he has the primary culprits put to death. He then returns to God to say, if you do not forgive them, blot me out of the book you have written. And that ties into last week's portion, Tetzaveh, right? The one portion where Moses' name is not mentioned in the Torah after he's born is kind of a fulfillment of that. But God does forgive, but says that the effect of their sin is going to be felt for many generations. At first, God proposes to send an angel along with the people. At this point, God is still, if we want to think of it in human terms, God is still so wounded by the betrayal. Remember, Sinai was this marriage, this covenant between God and his people. He's still very sore. He's still very betrayed. And so he's not sure, again, this is putting it in human terms, if he wants to take them back fully yet, right? And the way you could imagine if there was an infidelity in a marriage, right? The partner that has had the infidelity committed upon them may want the marriage restored, may desire that, but is probably going to be a little skeptical for a while. And so God says, look, I'm not going to go with you guys, but I will send an angel who will go with you and protect you. But Moses doesn't accept that. And so Moses once again begins conversation with God, intercedes on behalf of the people, and God acquiesces, and he agrees to accompany his people to the promised land. Then Moses prepares a new set of tablets. He once more ascends the mountain, and there God reinscribes the covenant on these second tablets. On the mountain, Moses is then granted a vision of God. He wants to see God. He wants to experience God. And the best we can get of that experience is he kind of has to come in the back door. God says, you can see my backside, which is just simply meaning coming in from the back is a safer way than coming in from the front. And Moses basically describes that experience with the 13 attributes, or what are known as the 13 attributes of mercy. So radiant is Moses' face when he returns. It's described as like a zohar, that he must cover it with a veil, and he removes it only when he speaks with God and when he teaches the people. So that's the summary of the basic storyline of the portion. So from there, let's kind of dive in the text. I want to eventually get into some of those jots and tittles. There's some good ones in this week's portion. We think about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, not one jot or tittle will pass away. What he's referring to is when you unroll a Torah scroll and you see the Hebrew written on the page, it's not all perfectly neat Hebrew in perfect columns, but instead it has gaps, it has spaces, it has some letters that are really large in a word and some letters that are really tiny. It has some words that are intentionally misspelled, are intentionally using the uncommon spelling. The way I could compare it again is the word color. We spell C-O-L-O-R in America, but in Great Britain you spell it C-O-L-O-U-R, right? And if I were writing a book and for 95 times it's spelled C-O-L-O-R, but on the 96th time you see it spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, you either think the editor didn't catch something or I did something on purpose, right? And so when the Torah does something like that, when it uses intentional kind of mutated spelling, it's to draw our attention, to draw us into it. That's what Jesus means by jot and tittle. So he's letting us know that there's more to the Torah than just the black letters on the page. And this week has a couple of good ones like that. And so I want to make sure we highlight those and see what those have to teach us. But first, let's look at the first verse is chapter 30, verse 11, which basically says God spoke to Moses, right? But the first main verse is chapter 30, verse 12. And this is my translation. So this is my literal translation. It says, when you lift up the heads of the people of Israel. Now, most translations will say, when you take a census. Or some might say, when you count the heads. Or when you count the people, which is a census, right? But the word census does not appear in the Hebrew. That's why I don't put it in my translation. It's not there in the Hebrew. It literally says this. When you lift up the heads of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his soul. I mean, think about that. We'll come back to these words. But it's not just making sure you physically build this structure. Remember, as we've been talking about the tabernacle, we've been talking about it's not just this physical structure that they built 3,000 years ago, but it's giving us the spiritual technology blueprints to build our own tabernacle. We are a tabernacle. We are a mishkan. We are the places where the Shekinah, the divine presence, can dwell in our midst and in this world. And so when you're giving this half shekel, you're doing it as a ransom for a soul to the Lord when you number them. So, TISA here begins with this idea on a Peshat level, level 1, the most simple meaning, to take a census of all the men in Israel, 20 years of age and over. But there are two unusual things about this particular census that I think have spiritual value for us even today. First, God does not actually use the verb to count in ordering the census. Instead, he uses the expression, when you lift up the heads of the children of Israel according to their numbers. Right? So he doesn't tell us to count. In fact, when you read through the Torah, when you read through the Bible, God doesn't like us counting people. In fact, in Orthodox Judaism today, if you were to ask an Orthodox Jewish person, how many children do you have? They will not say, I have 4 children, or I have 6 children, or I have 2 children. They'll say, I have less than a handful, or I have more than a handful, or I have, a handful and some. They will not tell you the exact number, and it comes from not only this place, but throughout Scripture, that God is not a fan of the counting of people, all right? And we'll unpack that as we go on. Secondly, the men are not to be counted directly. As you read on, how you end up getting the number is by counting the number of half shekels that have been contributed to the maintenance of the tabernacle. That's how they count. So they don't count people, they count shekels. And I still remember the first time I was asked when I was traveling to join what's called a minyan. So Orthodox Jews like to pray with at least 10 men. And so when you're traveling and you're in an airport or something like that and it's the time of day for prayer, they try to find 10 Jewish men to make up the quorum to pray. And so I have some obvious signs like the long payas and different things that indicate I'm Jewish. So an individual came to me and said, would you like to do mincha with us? We're trying to make a minyan. In other words, will you do evening prayer with us? I said, sure. I had my prayer book. I got it out. We walked over to a corner, and to count to see if we had 10, because you can't count people, he went, not 1, not 2, not 3. And I was like, all right. I knew what he was doing, but it made me chuckle. It made me chuckle. But some of that's coming from here, okay? The particular way the Torah describes, though, and conducts this census about not counting people, has much as well as the fact that it's a half shekel. It's not a whole shekel. It's a half shekel, all right? It has much to teach us, I think, about human reality as well as the human psyche. The sense of alienation, of being a nameless entity in a cold and impersonal world has perhaps never been stronger than it is today. It's true that we live in a world where everyone is just a fingertip away on our phone or on our tablet, but at the same time, the bonds of family and community are increasingly weakened in the proliferation of our computer-driven virtual reality metaverse, consumer society, and because of that, almost all of us at one time or another most certainly feel the sinking feeling that he or she is just a faceless number trapped in an ever-increasingly complex web of chaos, right? Even when we know we have friends, even when we know we have family, even though in one aspect we are more connected than ever in the history of the world, we also know, on the other hand, we're more disconnected than ever in the history of the world. It's the great paradox of how can we be so connected and yet so disconnected. It was no accident that the Nazi death machine put numbers on people's arms as a way of degrading them and robbing them of their humanity, their freedom, and their true identity, that these people simply became numbers. And it did not escape the Nazis of the Jewish belief and system about not numbering people, that they intentionally tattooed numbers on the people that don't number people. Right? Don't let that escape you. Therefore, the Torah instructs us not to count people the way we would count objects, because people are not objects. A human being can never be thought of as a number that is devoid of a unique personality and infinite worth. The Torah's method for conducting the census teaches us how to properly relate to other human beings. And not only must we relate to each individual as a unique person with their own giftings and so forth, we must also lift each and every one up to make them feel special and worthy. And that's where the importance of this verse comes in, right? It comes in when, what is Moses being called to do? He's being called to lift up their heads. Now think about that on a psychological, emotional, spiritual level. What's that really saying? And you can kind of hear or see a shadow of our Messiah in this, in his work. To whom did our Messiah, to whom did he spend so much of his time with? The outcasts, right? The outsiders, the downtrodden, right? Those who had their heads down. And so Moses is called to lift their heads up, to elevate them, to make them aware of their sense of worth, that they're more than just numbers, that they're more than just objects. And so he is to lift up their head. That's the true meaning of when you lift up the heads of the children of Israel. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, great 20th century rabbi who was just known for his song and his jovial spirit, would literally travel the world to visit the outcasts and the outsiders. And once when he was visiting a prison in the United States, and he was just there, he made like a tour of United States prisons just to visit the Jewish inmates, to bring them encouragement and hope. And as was his way, he hugged all of the prisoners that came to hear them, Jews and non-Jews. And as he was leaving, one of the inmates, a very large and muscular man, came running after Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, and it startled him, and it startled the guards, and they thought they were going to have a situation, and it kind of snuck up on them, and the man was right there in the rabbi's face before anybody could do anything. And then he kind of shyly, like a little baby boy, asked if Reb Shlomo could just give him one more hug. And of course, Rabbi Shlomo did that. And the man confided that if he would have had someone hug him like that regularly as he was growing up, he probably would not be in that prison today. That is lifting up the heads of the people. And that is one of Moses' tasks as a leader of the people, is to lift up their heads. To lift up another head entails looking beyond superficial appearances, and it involves revealing the divine spark within each individual. That when you look at each person, you are to see within that person someone created in the image of God. No matter how hard or how long it takes you to do that, you are to find that spark in the individual. And then further, we have the realization that we are all half shekels. That is, no one was permitted to give more or less to the tabernacle, no matter how rich or poor they were. Knowing that we're all just half without the other, meaning we need the other to make us whole, meaning we were made for community. We weren't made to be lone rangers and captains of our own ships. We were made to be in community, because when we are by ourselves, we are but a half, not a whole. That reins in our ego. It reduces our tendency to delude ourselves into thinking that we are somehow on our own whole, while others are but halves. It is the divine spark within each of us that imbues us with a sense of true completeness, enabling us to see much deeper and providing us the strength to lift up the heads of those in need and to make the whole with their half and our half. So that's a deeper significance on why it was a half a shekel. Half a shekel is not that much. It wasn't much back then. It's certainly not much now. In fact, in Israel, in post-1948, the modern state of Israel, they released a half shekel into their monetary system. It would be like releasing a half a penny into our monetary system. Like, why would you do that? There's no reason to do it other than this reason. It was a way of rejuvenating within them as a people what they were about, to remind them that they are only as good a nation as they are insofar as they realize they are nothing without one another. And so that is the reason the modern state of Israel still produces a half shekel. It's a powerful reminder of that. So let's keep going in the text. I'm going to look at a jot, a tittle. So in the Torah portion, TISA, when it comes to talk about the Sabbath, it says this in chapter 31, verse 17. God exclaims that this is between me and the children of Israel, meaning the Sabbath. It is forever, 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 not like sometime 2,000 years ago. It is forever a sign that in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he ceased and rested. In other words, it is ingrained in the DNA of creation. This is an argument from creation. This is the order of creation. So when we went through school, we learned laws of mathematics. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. We learned principles of gravity, that things fall at this rate of 9.8 and so forth and so on. We learned that these are indisputable laws of the universe. Well, one of the other indisputable laws of the universe is the idea that it has a rhythm of 6 days and then a day of rest. And I want us to look, if you see there that I have kind of underlined for us, that phrase or that word rested. All right? The word rested is coming from the Hebrew word vayi nafash, and he rested. Vayi nafash. But even if you don't read or speak Hebrew, right? You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see 5 Hebrew letters, right? You can count them. There's 5 Hebrew letters. Don't read it, don't speak it, but yet just looking at it, do you notice one of those 5 is different? Like, right? Hopefully you see one kind of really big, right? You see the really big one? That's a letter Peh, P-E-H. And that is when you unroll the Torah scroll, it's really big in that word. So that's what Jesus means when he says not one jot or tittle will pass away. So that says, put on the brakes, start asking some questions, right? Something's different about this word. It doesn't just mean any rested. That letter Peh is written differently. It's called a double Peh, kind of if you think about it. Big Peh, it's double in size, if you will. And significantly, the root word of vayi nafash is nephesh. The last 3 letters of that root make up the word nephesh, which is the Torah's all-inclusive word for soul. All right? And so, based on both of these observations, the Baal HaTurim comments that the doubled Peh in this verse is an allusion. It's alluding us to the fact, the teaching of the sages, that on the Sabbath, just as there's a double Peh there in the word nephesh, we have what you might call a double soul. Or sometimes it's translated as 2 souls. Or a soul or an aspect of our soul that is only perceivable on the Sabbath if we take the time to properly connect on the Sabbath. Then we not only connect to God in a different way than we can on the other 6 days, but there's an aspect of ourselves that we connect to that we cannot connect to on the other 6 days of the week. It's kind of like the recharge. It's to recharge your nephesh. Nephesh meaning soul, nephesh meaning life. Nephesh is like your being, right? And it's got a double Peh here. There are traditionally 2 possible ways to understand this additional level of the soul, the double soul. Either it enters us from above as the Sabbath comes upon us and as we begin to make our connection to it, or we become aware of an intrinsic level of the soul that's always present in us. It's our soul, but an aspect of it that becomes active when we begin to celebrate the Sabbath. And as we've learned, when we are faced with choices, this or that, the answer is neither this or that, but some combination of both. A further insight can be seen in the verse, between me and the children of Israel, it is forever a sign. In 6 days God created the heaven and the earth, and the 7th day he rested. The acronym, if you take the acronym of the 4 Hebrew words that make up the children of Israel, is forever a sign, which is B'nai Yisrael Ot He. The acronym, the first letter of each of those words, it spells Bia, which kind of means the intimacy between husband and wife. It's the proper way to say that, right? That's the proper intimacy between husband and wife, is Bia. Then, in the preceding verse, thus shall the children of Israel observe the Sabbath and make the Sabbath an everlasting covenant to all generations. The first letters of that also spell Bia. The allusion and the hint is that on the Sabbath there is this intimate love, this intimate relationship between God and his people and God's people and the Sabbath. It's like the marital union of the two come together, God and his people, in this very intimate way on the Sabbath. And that's one of the reasons, from a spiritual technology point of view, you want the cycle of rest in your weekly rhythm. Because not only is it just good for you physically, quite frankly, I think we could all agree taking a day off is good for you mentally and physically, and good for your family and good for your relationships and so forth. But it has these other spiritual aspects to it as well, including an intimacy with God because of the elevated status of your soul that only occurs during that day of the week. And that's why it's repeated throughout Scripture, the importance of this day. Let's keep reading. Lack of patience. When TISA discusses this disastrous sin of the golden calf, it's described this way. And this is coming from Exodus chapter 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was late, some translations have was delayed, same thing, but was late in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aaron, and they said to him, "Come on, make us a god." But I want you to see there what they said in Hebrew, so I'll put it in brackets. They weren't wanting another god. They had just come out of Egypt. They had not forgotten who God was. They had not forgotten the 10 plagues. They had not forgotten those miracles. They had not forgotten that they passed through the Red Sea. They had no doubts that God is God. So they were not saying, make us a little g god, a little statue, or that they were wondering. They said God's name. They said, make us Elohim. Make us Elohim. All right, make us Elohim that will go before us. Because you remember way back earlier in Exodus when God sent Moses to Pharaoh, God said to Moses and the people, Moses will be Elohim to Pharaoh. He will be God. When Pharaoh encounters Moses, it's like encountering God. This hopefully is bringing a shadow of the Messiah. Hey, Jesus, show us the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Early in Exodus, God said, if you've seen Moses and you've encountered Moses and his miracles and his power, then you have encountered me. He became the mediator between the people and God, the intercessor. He was their conduit. He was their interface. He was their visible form of Elohim. Dare we say, almost like an incarnation of God for them. We won't go that far. It's a shadow, but that's what it's pointing to when you get to the greater Moses in Jesus. So all they're asking for is what? Essentially, a replacement for Moses. It's not that unreasonable a request. Now, how they go about it being caused by their panic and their wild imaginations and their leadership vacuum, and when people try to take advantage of leadership vacuums, right? When there's a leadership vacuum, there's the people who are good, right, and salutary, trying to steady the ship, but then there are also people that are like, I haven't been able to get my way for 15 years. That sucker's gone, right? I am going to take over. I'm finally going to get my way around here. Right? That took over. And so the golden calf became that replacement. But they ask for Elohim who goes before us. That was Moses. That's what God said Moses was. So don't get in your head that these are just wild, crazy idiots, who don't know what they're doing, who've abandoned all their faith, right? We have a hard time kind of putting ourselves in their shoes because it is such a spectacular occasion that they experienced their experience, but this makes much more human sense. Moses was their go-between. They think their go-between is dead, so what do they want? They want another go-between. Because this man, Moses, who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. We don't know if he just got tired of us and got scared or whatever and ran off. We don't know if he died. We don't know anything. So we want a replacement. That's how it starts. Now, when we look at this verse and it says Moses was late, Moses was delayed, the Hebrew word for late or delayed is boshesh. Boshesh. But it's intentionally defective in spelling. You can spell it that way. It's just not how you would spell it. It should have a letter vav in it. Now, it's interesting because bo and shais are two words put together. Shais is the Hebrew number for 6. The letter vav that it's missing is also the Hebrew number 6. It's the 6th letter of the alphabet, which means it's the number 6. And so you got 6 at the end of this word, and it's missing the number 6 in its spelling. And so this is one of those jots and tittles. It's a defective spelling, but not because it was an error by Moses or the scribe, but it was an inspired one. And again, it's written without the letter vav, whose numerical value is 6. The word shesh also means 6. Thus, the word itself, along with its defective spelling, alludes to the fact of the tradition that the mixed multitude, those who came out of Egypt with Moses and the children of Israel, remember when they left, some people were like, oh, we want to go, take us with you, right? And they really weren't part of Israel, and Moses allowed them to come. It says that those are the ones who began to panic after only 6 hours of what they perceived was Moses' tardiness. As Moses set out, they perceived Moses was supposed to be back at this time, and because from their perspective he was 6 hours late, they began to look for a replacement. The Midrash states that Satan came and created an illusion in the clouds that appeared to be the coffin of Moses, fueling the belief that Moses was dead. But of course, this Midrash is really trying to teach us a deeper point. It's not about if it's a true story or not. That's never the point. It's trying to teach us how fear gets a hold of us. And when fear gets a hold of us, we become Satan's playground. When we become afraid, we make all kinds of bad decisions. We make all kinds of bad judgments. We do all kinds of bad behaviors, even if it's coming from a good kind of somewhere back in the background, good place. When we are fearful and we're operating out of fear and out of scarcity, right, it leads us into very bad places. In fact, the Hebrew word for the power of imagination, that's what the Midrash was trying to teach, that because things didn't go exactly as they planned, their imaginations ran wild with them. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for the power of the imagination is koach ha-medemeh. And if you add up its letters, it equals 122. If you take the word for golden calf, egel hazahav, and you add up its letters, it also equals 122. So the deeper teaching of the golden calf isn't that they were really so much building this calf that they were going to worship, though they may have done that. It's trying to describe the foolish mistakes we can make, even if we come from what we think are good places, if we are driven by fear and let our imaginations get the best of us. And maybe you've been in a place like that where someone you view as a leader either moves or leaves or abuses the power of their office and so forth. And so you therefore have not a necessarily complete view of reality. You've got fear and suspicion and doubt. You have a lot of baggage you're carrying with that. From a gematria point of view, you've just created a golden calf. You've just created a golden calf. The commentaries explain that, in fact, Moses wasn't late at all. Rather, there was a misunderstanding as when he was to return from his 40 days on the mountain with God. He basically said, "Be back in 40 days." And because they misunderstood that, that led them astray. But due to this miscalculation and their lack of patience, many people panicked and gave up on Moses ever returning. Now, there's a little bit of a shadow of our Messiah here. Can you think of a situation in the life of our Messiah where he goes up on a mountain and he says, "Don't worry, I'm coming back. I'm going to come back the way you see me going up. That's the way I'm going to come back," because that's what Moses said. And he goes up on the mountain and he hasn't come back. And so soon people begin to think, well, he's never coming back. We must have misunderstood that, right? And all kinds of things begin to take over the imagination. Can you think of Jesus going up on a mountain and disappearing and not coming back yet? I think you can, right? We're still at the bottom of the mountain, aren't we? We could be tempted to think, he's never coming back. It's not true. He wasn't the Messiah. Fill in the blank. We could let the power of our imagination take us away. We could let the lack of our patience for his return to bring the Messianic kingdom, we could let our lack of patience for that take us askew. Right? So there's a shadow there. Interestingly, the word in Hebrew for wisdom is chokmah. When its letters are permuted, they spell mekake, which means to wait. So part of the word wisdom has embedded within it the concept of waiting. So part of wisdom, or part of being wise, is having the ability to wait. Having patience. If you lack patience, that is one real important way to know you lack wisdom. If you ever wondered if you had wisdom and you are a very impatient person, you do not have wisdom from a biblical perspective. There are other things that make up wisdom. That's one of them, though. The wisdom to determine when to go forward and when to have patience and bide one's time involves a very high level of consciousness and spiritual maturity. Various commentaries teach that there are 3 cardinal sins in the Bible that all involve the inability to simply wait. So when we think about reading the Torah portion in the times, how can we apply it to our lives today? What are you struggling with patience for right now? What are you having a hard time waiting on right now? This is a very opportune time to be praying about that, to be talking about that with people, to be journaling about that, to be contemplating that, and to be dealing with that, because this is the week of that portion, right? There's the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The commandment was given to them on the 6th day. They also disobeyed and ate it on the 6th day, right? The 6th hour of the 6th day, which is why Jesus is crucified on the 6th hour of the 6th day. He's making the repair for the original sin. According to the tradition, if they would have just waited until the Sabbath began, they could have not only partaken from everything, but they could have also partaken from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life as well. Everything was fair game. They only had to wait until sundown. They couldn't even make it a day. They couldn't even make it a day. Subsequently, all human history has been affected and death, together with many other consequences, has become our existential reality. The second sin related to this impatience is the golden calf. And the third one occurs with David's premature instigation of his relations with Bathsheba. Because if you read that and study that text in depth enough, you will find that Bathsheba was his soulmate, and that he didn't need to rush that would have been brought about in God's timing, in God's way, in a God-pleasing manner. But David acted very problematically. Instead of allowing time to run its course so that their union would be pure, he rushed it. And these 3 episodes have a common theme. In each instance, people acted prematurely, before the correct time, lacking the wisdom or strength to wait. And these are archetypal in nature, and they point to our choices that we face all the time. So what are you struggling with this week? What are you having a hard time being patient with? Really pray about it this week and read this portion again. When you read this portion again, read it with that in mind, because it will make the connections. This is the place to make the connections. And then finally, being mindful of TISA. I kind of like to close each week with a little bit of a discourse of taking the text, and then how do we turn that into a mindful practice? How do we personalize this story? So I want to do that now. At the archetypal level, for several weeks now, we've been talking about how we have been building a mishkan, a tabernacle, a temple inside of each one of us. The holy place where the divine presence dwells. And the tabernacle, though, it's also built not only in us, but it's built between us. God dwells in our midst whenever we make profound connections with each other. When we are in loving relationships and community, the divine reveals itself to us. That's the power of the half shekel. You're only a half. You become a whole once you become a whole with your soulmate, or when you become a whole with a community, or you become a whole in a relationship, but you need another. You need another to become whole. With the offering of the half shekel, we are being called to build this aspect of the tabernacle together. TISA tells us that everyone, no matter how rich or poor, is commanded to make an equal contribution. No one gets a special gold plate because of how much they gave. Everybody's on equal ground. Those half shekels are collected, and here's what they were used for. This is powerful imagery. They were used for the casting of the sockets of the sanctuary, of the tabernacle, the pieces that held everything together. That's what those half shekels of silver were used for. They were used to make the sockets of the tabernacle that kept the whole structure together. So what a blessing to know that my half shekel is necessary and it's valued. And what a blessing it is to look around me and acknowledge that everyone has something to contribute that's going to hold the structure of the sacred in place. How amazing it is to know that we are not whole by ourselves, but it takes the other, a community, to complete us. I am not alone in my contributions, nor may I withhold my presence from the sacred task. And as we read at the very beginning, the half shekel, remember how I pointed out it's called a ransom for your soul? For your soul is truly in danger if you do not consciously contribute to this tabernacle of community and acknowledge the equal value of each and every person. We can only build this holy place together. And we cannot sustain a spiritual practice that is blind of our interdependency upon one another. The half shekel we contribute is a reminder of the truth of our interdependency. And so giving it consciously, We are saying, count me in. And so this week, ask yourself, what have you said, count me in, that's completing you? How have you told your congregation, count me in? I'm all about making this place holy. I'm all about being melted down and made part of the socket that keeps the framework of this place running. How have you said to your family, count me in? I don't expect you to do all for me. We're all for one another. Count me in. At your job, wow, what an epidemic we're in where so many people, when they go to work, do not say, count me in. Because they don't see that everybody's connected. And if you are a very poor employee and don't do your job very well, everybody suffers. And everybody's job suffers. And the organization suffers. And the customer suffers. And the client suffers. And it goes on and on and on and on because we won't say, count me in. Here's my half shekel. I am in. Just being alive and present and giving my all, I become part of a community. My half shekel then redeems me. That's how it's a ransom. It redeems me from the illusion of separation. The blessing of the half shekel is that it saves me from the inflation of self-importance. After all, in the end, it's only half a shekel. I'm only half a shekel, only a minuscule part of the whole. It's good to be reminded of that sometimes. And the blessing of the half shekel saves me from invisibility or demeaning of my self-worth, knowing that my contribution does really matter and I am important. After all, my contribution is just of the same value as yours and anybody else's. The tabernacle couldn't be held together without it. And so it has the balancing act of humbling you and lifting up your head. TISA goes on then to bless us with the attention to the details of some of the instruments and vessels of the tabernacle. The laver, the anointing oil, the incense, for the task of constructing and crafting our spiritual practice and the structure of our religious life. God turns from Moses the prophet, and he turns from Aaron the priest, and he goes to Bezalel, who is an artist. Bezalel is described as an artist or a craftsman. And the true artist within us and among us is filled with the Spirit of God and blesses us as he blessed Bezalel with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The name Bezalel literally means in the shadow or the image of God. But it also means the divine egg. Right? And what comes forth from an egg? Life. It's the divine egg. That part of us, that artistic part of us, that creative part of us, sheltered underneath the wings of our tabernacle, it incubates immense divine potential. And so there's a Bezalel inside of you, a divine egg inside of you, incubating in your tabernacle, just waiting to hatch with the potential that you have as a being created in the image and the likeness of your Creator. The instruction and descriptions of the building of the tabernacle, it constitutes the climax of our journey to freedom that began when we left Egypt. When you have built a place in your life for the divine presence to dwell, then your ongoing and growing relationship to the eternal frees you from the enslavement of a conditioned mind. It's interesting to note that TISA, this week's portion, inserts into the middle of the tabernacle text, as it's discussing the tabernacle, it inserts the most serious spiritual challenge to our freedom. That challenge is represented by the story of the golden calf, which points to exemplifying a quintessential sin. So the portion kind of is like a sandwich. It's tabernacle, golden calf, tabernacle. Right? And so it's like, why is the golden calf incident the meat in this tabernacle sandwich? That structure is designed to draw our attention to it so that we can learn an important lesson from it. I've wondered sometimes, I've already kind of expressed, what was so bad about this sin? Like, why is this one of the most notorious sins on planet Earth? Why does it literally rank up there with Adam and Eve's fall? I mean, to me, it sounds kind of logical. Moses was sent as your redeemer. Moses has done a whole lot of redeeming works for you. Moses has saved your hide time and time again. Moses is a miracle worker. Moses is able to provide food from the desert. Moses is able to provide water from a rock. Moses is Moses, and now Moses is gone. Why is it so bad that they, panicked and wanted another Moses? After 40 days of waiting, they grew restless and afraid. Moses, again, was, after all, their exclusive mediator between God and the people. His absence left a void, and the people cried out to fill that emptiness with an image that would comfort them. The only way to understand the golden calf is to compare it to the tabernacle. That's why it's the meat in the tabernacle sandwich. For the building of the tabernacle is the context of the story of the golden calf. The tabernacle exists for the space that is within it. It is a structure that is built to send us to that holy innerness. All of the beauty, the color, the fabrics, the design are dedicated as a nexus point between the human and the divine. That's the tabernacle, between heaven and earth. The important part is not the outer form, but what's on the inside. For that is where God really speaks to us. The further within you get, the more holy the space is. In contrast to that, the meat in the sandwich is glaring contrast. The golden calf is solid, and it exists of and for itself. We supply the gold, but then the calf seems to come to life all on its own. As Aaron said, quote, "I just cast the gold into the fire and out came this calf." The calf has no interior space. It glorifies itself. It's full of itself. It represents the most dangerous hindrance in the life of spiritual practice. That of worshiping and staying attached to the forms, rather than allowing those forms to send us inward to the essence. This is the spiritual challenge of TISA for us. How can I dedicate my life to a spiritual practice without turning the form of my practice into an idol? That's something to think about. Do we sometimes turn our forms into our actual religion? It's the difference between building a tabernacle and building a golden calf. And it's a very subtle difference. And that's why the Torah has the golden calf inserted right in the middle of all the stuff about the tabernacle. Because it's a fine line between building the tabernacle and building the golden calf. The danger is that we can come to love religion more than we come to love God. I remember a very telling statement of one of my seminary classmates. It was about 20 years after we were out. I'd started seminary. And I met up with him at a conference. And we weren't that close in seminary, but we knew each other. But at this conference, we just started having dialogue. But he was always one that was very rigid in seminary, like very rigid, very focused, very studious. And he said it was only recently that he realized that all through seminary and much of his early ministry, he was taught and he studied and he learned to love theology. But he was never taught or learned to love people, our God. So we have to be careful on what we're building. We can come to love religion, or theology, or knowledge more than God. who is beyond all of those things. The Torah, the tribe, the prayers, the language, these all can become a golden calf, glorifying itself, binding us to its power and beauty. There's a great story, a midrash. It says when Moses went up on the mountain and he stayed for those 40 days, that God personally inscribed all the words on those tablets that Moses carried. It was literally the handwriting of God. They were made holy by the signature of the divine himself. And when Moses descended the mountain carrying those holy tablets, he saw below him the people worshiping and celebrating the golden calf. And he cried out to God and said, "Look at what the people are doing. If I bring these tablets with your handwriting it on down to them, they will make this into an idol too. And they will worship these instead of you." And I think you know enough about human nature to know, oh, how true that would be. What do you think would happen if I actually had the cross Jesus was crucified on? Do you think it's possible some people would come to worship it and that it would become an idol? Probably, right? So God hears Moses, and so he sends a strong wind, and it blows the stone tablets out of his hand, and it smashes into the ground into a million particles of dust. But each piece of dust, each small microscopic piece of dust, has a portion of the signature of God. God then sends all the winds, the north, the east, the south, the west, and tells the winds to carry that dust and to cover the entire planet with pieces of that dust. And then God says, if the people want to know me, they can ponder and appreciate what is all around them. Because if their eyes are truly open, they will already see my handwriting on everyone and everything. It's a fine line between building yourself a tabernacle and building yourself a golden calf. Be careful as you are constructing, as we go through the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, as you're constructing your tabernacle, as you are creating that space inside for the Shekinah to dwell, and not just more space for you to dwell. We will close there for this evening. Let's close with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Blessed are you, Lord God, who has given to us the gift that is the Torah. Amen. Chag Sameach Purim. Have a good Purim, everybody. Remember, read the book of Esther sometime in the next 24 hours and absorb its truth. The energy is alive and well. God's fingerprint is on everything.